still remember the sharp crack that echoed across the dining room when my brother-in-law smacked me at my own Christmas dinner for serving myself before him. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The soft Christmas music kept playing. The tree lights continued to blink. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filled the room as if nothing had happened. My cheek burned where his hand had landed, and the serving spoon slipped from my fingers, clattering against my plate. He leaned closer with a smug smile that made my stomach turn. "Don't forget your place in this family." The room stayed silent. My husband lowered his eyes to his plate. My mother-in-law adjusted a napkin without looking at me. My father-in-law took another sip of wine as though slapping the host of Christmas dinner was perfectly acceptable entertainment. That silence hurt more than the slap. I'd spent 3 days preparing everything. Every decoration, every dessert, every wrapped gift under the tree had been chosen by me. I had cleaned the house from top to bottom, paid for most of the groceries myself, and welcomed everyone with genuine excitement, hoping, once again, that this Christmas would finally feel like family. Instead, I was reminded exactly where they believed I belonged. I looked around the table. Not one person asked if I was okay. Not one person told him he'd gone too far. Their expressions carried something even colder than anger. Expectation. As if they were waiting for me to apologize. A strange calm settled over me. I slowly placed my fork on the table. Then I stood, looked my brother-in-law straight in the eyes, and smacked him back with exactly the same force. The room exploded into gasps. His confident grin vanished instantly, replaced by pure disbelief. He held his cheek, staring at me as though I'd broken an unwritten family law. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult him. I simply said, "Now we're even." No one realized that the slap wasn't the moment that would change everything. It was the silence that followed. Because while everyone else was still trying to process what had happened, I had already made a decision. That Christmas dinner would be the last time anyone in that family would ever mistake my kindness for weakness. People who met me for the first time usually assumed I was quiet because I lacked confidence. The truth was much simpler. I believed that not every battle deserved a loud response. I worked as a financial controller for a regional construction company, a career that rewarded patience, careful planning, and noticing details other people overlooked. Solving problems without creating drama had become second nature to me. I carried that same mindset into my marriage, convinced that kindness and consistency would eventually earn respect. I was wrong. My husband, Daniel, came from a family where the loudest voice almost always won. His older brother, Eric, had spent his entire life acting as though every room belonged to him. Family dinners revolved around his opinions, holidays followed his schedule, and disagreements somehow ended with everyone apologizing to him instead. The first time I noticed it, I thought it was just an awkward family dynamic. The second year, I realized it was a pattern. By the 5th Christmas, I understood it was a system. If Eric interrupted me, everyone laughed. If he criticized my cooking, they called it just his sense of humor. If he ordered me to refill drinks or clear plates while everyone else relaxed, nobody questioned it, not even Daniel. Whenever I quietly mentioned how disrespectful it felt, my husband would sigh and tell me, "That's just how Eric is. Don't make everything into a fight." So I stopped arguing. Not because I agreed. Because I was paying attention. Every insult, every dismissive comment, every holiday where I was treated more like hired help than family became another piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was assembling. They mistook my silence for surrender, when in reality it was observation. They believed I needed their approval to belong. What none of them understood was that I had never depended on their acceptance. I had simply been waiting to discover exactly who they were before deciding what they deserved from me. Christmas had always followed the same script, and somehow I was the only one who seemed to notice. A week before dinner, my phone would begin filling with messages from my mother-in-law. She would ask me to host because my house was the most comfortable, then casually mention that everyone expected my cooking since I was so good at it. By the end of the conversation, I was responsible for the menu, the decorations, the shopping, and even buying small gifts for the children because you're better at choosing them. No one ever offered to split the cost. No one ever asked if I needed help. They simply arrived, complimented the house, and acted as though everything had appeared by magic. Eric always entered last. He never knocked. He pushed the front door open like he owned the place, dropped his coat onto the nearest chair, and looked around with the quiet confidence of someone expecting to be served. His eyes would skim over the table, checking whether everything met his standards, before giving a slow nod that felt less like appreciation and more like approval. "Looks decent this year," he'd say, as if I had been waiting all day for his opinion. Daniel would laugh softly. "So generous," he joked. Everyone smiled. I forced one of my own. During dinner, the pattern continued. If someone asked me a question, Eric answered it before I could speak. If I shared an idea, he redirected the conversation within seconds. When I stood to refill empty glasses, nobody else moved. They simply watched me drift between the kitchen and the dining room as though I had naturally become part of the household staff. Each slight was small enough to dismiss on its own. Together, they painted a much clearer picture. I caught myself studying their faces more than joining their conversations. The quick glances they exchanged, the comfortable way they expected my silence, the certainty that I would absorb every insult without complaint, it all felt rehearsed. By that Christmas evening, I realized something unsettling. They weren't testing my patience anymore. They had already decided it had no limit. The slap should have been the moment that broke me. Instead, it cleared my mind. As the shock faded from the room, I noticed something I had missed for years. Nobody looked horrified by what Eric had done. They were horrified that I had answered him. Their eyes weren't filled with concern, they were filled with disbelief that I had stepped outside the role they had written for me. Daniel finally spoke. "What were you thinking?" he asked. For a second, I thought he was talking to his brother. He wasn't. He was looking directly at me. That single question settled everything I had been trying to convince myself wasn't true. I wasn't married to a man who failed to stand up for me once. I was married to someone who expected me to accept being disrespected if it kept his family comfortable. I felt strangely peaceful. Years of making excuses disappeared in a matter of seconds. I picked up my napkin, folded it neatly beside my untouched plate, and looked around the table one last time. No anger. No tears. Just clarity. In that quiet moment, I made a decision no one else could see. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to demand an apology. I was going to let every one of them discover what life looked like after they lost the person who had quietly held everything together. And unlike the slap, that lesson would last far longer than a few seconds. I left the dining room without another word and began clearing the kitchen while everyone else resumed eating. They mistook my silence for defeat. It wasn't. It was the first move. For years, I had managed nearly every practical part of our household. Because of my background in finance and contract management, I kept meticulous records. Every mortgage payment, utility bill, renovation invoice, insurance policy, and shared account statement was organized in secure digital folders. It wasn't because I expected a fight one day. It was simply how I lived. That night, after the last guest left, I didn't raise my voice or revisit the argument. I sat in my home office, opened my laptop, and reviewed everything with fresh eyes. I made copies of financial records, downloaded statements from our joint accounts, and documented the expenses I had personally covered for years, including every Christmas dinner that had somehow become my responsibility. I changed the passwords on my personal accounts, backed up important documents, and scheduled appointments with both a family law solicitor and a financial advisor for the following week. Then I cancelled every future family gathering I had agreed to host. No announcements. No dramatic messages. Just quiet, practical decisions. By midnight, my plan was complete. I wasn't interested in humiliating Eric or winning a shouting match with Daniel. Arguments fade. Evidence doesn't. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to their behavior. I was preparing for a future in which their choices would finally have consequences, and I intended to let patience, planning, and the truth do all the talking. The consequences didn't arrive with raised voices or dramatic confrontations. They arrived with ordinary mornings. A week later, Daniel came home expecting life to continue as it always had. Instead, he found a neatly organized folder waiting on the dining table. Inside were copies of our household finances, a proposed separation agreement from my solicitor, and a simple note. I'm no longer willing to finance a life where disrespect is treated as tradition. Nothing else. No accusations. No insults. Just facts. Over the following days, the family began to feel the absence they had never imagined possible. Christmas dinners, birthdays, and weekend gatherings no longer happened at my house because I simply stopped volunteering. Without my planning, no one stepped forward. Invitations became awkward group messages that ended in silence. Meals were cancelled. Traditions quietly disappeared. Eric tried calling several times. I never answered. For the first time, he couldn't command an audience. Daniel asked if we could put everything behind us. I calmly reminded him that the slap wasn't the reason I left. His decision to defend it was. There was nothing to argue about. The documents spoke for themselves, and so did years of bank records showing who had carried the financial and emotional weight of our marriage. Months later, I heard through mutual friends that family gatherings had become tense and uncomfortable. Without someone smoothing over every conflict, old resentments surfaced on their own. I never celebrated their discomfort. I simply continued building a peaceful life where respect was no longer something I had to earn. That quiet decision became the most powerful response I had ever given. News traveled through the family faster than I expected, but not in the way anyone had predicted. At first, I was painted as the difficult one. Eric told relatives that I had overreacted over a harmless family disagreement. Daniel insisted our marriage had fallen apart because I refused to forgive. For a little while, some people believed them. Then reality caught up. When birthdays were forgotten, nobody organized them. When holidays approached, no one volunteered to host. The thoughtful gifts, carefully planned meals, and quiet effort that had always held the family together were suddenly missing. One by one, relatives began asking the same question. Who used to do all of this? The answer was obvious. Without trying to defend myself, my reputation quietly repaired itself. The people who genuinely wanted the truth reached out to hear my side. I never exaggerated. I simply described what had happened and let the years of consistent behavior speak louder than one dramatic evening. Daniel apologized more than once. Eric never did. By then, it no longer mattered. The greatest consequence wasn't the distance between us. It was the distance I finally placed between my self-worth and their approval. I stopped measuring my value by how useful I could be to people who rarely appreciated me. Looking back, I realized the Christmas slap had exposed something far bigger than one man's temper. It revealed what everyone around that table was willing to tolerate. That's why stories like mine matter. Disrespect rarely begins with one unforgettable moment. It grows through 100 small silences, each one teaching someone that your dignity is negotiable. The day you quietly decide it isn't, everything else begins to change. The first Christmas after I left was the quietest I had experienced in years. I woke before sunrise, made myself a cup of coffee, and watched snow settle across the garden. There were no anxious text messages asking what time dinner would be. No endless shopping lists. No pressure to impress people who measured love by what they could take from someone else. For the first time in a long time, peace didn't feel unfamiliar. It felt like home. The separation eventually became final. We divided our lives fairly, and I walked away with something far more valuable than a house or a bank account. I walked away with the certainty that protecting my dignity was never a selfish decision. Months later, I accepted a promotion at work that required more travel and greater responsibility. The confidence I had spent years giving away slowly returned. I reconnected with old friends, visited my parents more often, and began saying no without apologizing for it. Every now and then, someone would tell me that Eric still blamed me for destroying the family. I never argued. Families aren't destroyed by the person who refuses to accept disrespect. They're damaged by the people who expect it. Looking back, I no longer remember the sting of his hand as clearly as I remember the silence around that table. That silence taught me a lesson I wish I had learned much earlier. People reveal their character not only by what they do, but by what they allow others to do. If my story has any meaning, I hope it's this. You don't have to win every argument. You don't have to shout louder than the people who underestimate you. Sometimes the strongest revenge is quietly removing yourself from the place where your kindness is treated as weakness and letting life reveal your value in your absence. That Christmas began with a slap. It ended with my freedom. And looking back now, I realize the greatest gift I unwrapped that year wasn't sitting beneath the tree. It was finally choosing myself.